You begin to notice that confusion arises precisely when reason reaches those limits. It is an accurate response, not a deficiency. When thought can no longer justify its own basis, the mind senses this boundary and calls it confusion. But the boundary itself is a form of knowledge, a recognition of where reason must yield to something deeper. Al Ghazali realized that the deepest distortions do not come from flawed arguments but from the self that uses those arguments to protect itself. The mind is not merely a thinking tool, it is influenced by desires, fears, and identities that shape what it accepts as rational. As you examine your own thinking, you notice this influence. Some ideas feel true because they preserve comfort. Others feel false because they challenge who you believe yourself to be. The evaluation appears logical, but beneath the reasoning lies the subtle movement of the self. It selects, emphasizes, and rejects long before thought becomes conscious. You begin to see that confusion often arises not from lack of reasoning but from conflict between truth and the self's need for stability. When truth threatens identity, reasoning becomes defensive. When clarity requires letting go of assumptions, the self resists. Confusion appears at these moments, signaling the presence of this conflict. Recognizing this does not lead to self-judgment. It leads to self-understanding. Al Ghazali insisted that the self must be seen clearly if clarity itself is to become possible. When the influence of identity becomes visible, thought loses some of its distortion. What once appeared as confusion becomes an opportunity to see the self's involvement in every judgment you make. For Al Ghazali, doubt was not destruction but purification. He treated doubt as a disciplined tool that exposes assumptions and cleanses the mind of what cannot withstand examination. Rather than weakening understanding, doubt strengthens it by removing beliefs that survive only through neglect. As you begin to use doubt in this way, you notice how it stabilizes thought rather than destabilizing it. You question not to undermine truth but to clear away illusions that once felt secure. Doubt loosens the grip of inherited ideas, cultural expectations, and personal biases. It reveals which convictions are grounded and which are merely familiar. Through this process, confusion shifts from being a threat to being a diagnostic signal. Each moment of uncertainty becomes a pointer towards something unexamined. The mind becomes lighter, more transparent, and less tied to assumptions that once shaped every judgment. You start to see why Al Ghazali valued doubt so deeply. It is the method by which the seeker moves from habit to authenticity. Confusion is no longer the enemy, it is the doorway. Doubt is no longer the failure, it is the purification that reveals what remains when all that is false falls away. You begin with the assumption that you understand your own mind. You believe your thoughts arise from clarity, that your conclusions grow from logic, and that the certainty you feel corresponds to truth. Yet when you pause, you notice an instability beneath that confidence. Al Ghazali recognized this long before you. What you call understanding may be nothing more than a familiar pattern that repeats itself because it has never been questioned. What you call confusion may be the mind's first honest response to recognizing the limits of its own tools. Al Ghazali pointed out that the mind measures everything with itself, never stepping outside its own structure. You start to wonder whether confusion is not a flaw but evidence that awareness is finally observing the machinery behind its certainty. If the mind uses itself to measure itself, how does it ever know what it truly knows? In 11th century Baghdad, Al Ghazali lived among scholars who built elaborate systems of logic to secure truth. Philosophers defended abstract reasoning, theologians argued over doctrine, and mystics emphasized inner perception. The intellectual world was rich, structured, and confident in its ability to dissect reality. Yet Al Ghazali noticed something unsettling. Despite their brilliance, these thinkers remained inwardly uncertain. He saw that no external argument could resolve the internal fractures within a seeker's mind. Certainty could not be imported from scholarship. It had to be grounded in the condition of the one who sought it. Al Ghazali reached a point where the familiar sources of knowledge began to unravel. He realized that perception could deceive, that memory could distort itself without warning, and that reasoning could rest on assumptions it never examined. This recognition did not lead him to despair. It pushed him into a deeper honesty. As you reflect on this crisis, you notice something similar. Much of what you call understanding is constructed on layers you rarely question. Confusion arises not because you lack intelligence, but because the mind senses that its foundations are not as solid as they appear. The crisis becomes an entry point, not an ending. Confusion often feels like a failure, a sign that your thoughts have lost stability. But Al Ghazali saw it differently. To him, confusion signaled that the mind was finally confronting the limits of its inherited certainty. Old frameworks no longer aligned with the questions you were asking. The disorientation was not collapse, it was the beginning of transparency. As you reflect inwardly, you notice how quickly thoughts form conclusions before you consciously agree with them. A belief appears complete the moment it arises, and only later do you realize that you never examined its structure. When confusion interrupts this automatic process, it creates space for reflection. The mind becomes aware of its own habits, rather than simply functioning through them. This moment, when familiar thought patterns lose their authority, becomes the threshold Al Ghazali considered essential. It is the point at which you stop trusting the momentum of your mind and begin watching it instead. Confusion becomes a kind of presence. It alerts you that you are no longer moving on assumptions. Once this shift begins, reflection transforms from an occasional pause into a deliberate inquiry. You begin to recognize how thought constructs clarity, and how that clarity is sometimes built from unexamined repetition instead of genuine insight. Al Ghazali understood that the mind is not a neutral observer. It operates within a structure shaped by expectations, cultural influences, and personal habits. Most of the time, you do not see the structure, you only see the conclusions it produces. But beneath those conclusions lies an architecture that silently guides interpretation long before you become aware of it. As you examine your thoughts more carefully, you begin to notice patterns you once considered natural. You see how the mind anticipates meaning before it arrives, how it arranges impressions into coherence, and how it fills gaps without acknowledging them. The clarity you once trusted begins to feel constructed rather than discovered. This recognition does not weaken your intelligence. It strengthens your capacity to observe. You understand that your interpretations are not purely the result of reasoning but are shaped by frameworks formed long before reasoning begins. Al Ghazali emphasized that these invisible influences must be revealed if the seeker wishes to understand anything honestly. What once appeared as confusion now becomes a sign that deeper structures are coming into view. The mind is not malfunctioning. It is becoming visible to itself. And with this visibility comes the possibility of seeing truth without the distortions the architecture once imposed. Reason appears powerful because it examines, compares, and evaluates. Yet Al Ghazali discovered a subtle limitation. Reason cannot justify the assumptions it relies upon. It can test conclusions, but it cannot validate the foundations from which those conclusions arise. Every rational system begins with premises that reason itself cannot prove. You begin to see this within your own thinking. You rely on the consistency of logic, yet you cannot prove its reliability without using logic itself. You trust memory, yet you cannot guarantee its accuracy. You depend on perception, though you know it can deceive. Each of these foundations supports your reasoning, yet none can secure itself. This realization does not destroy rationality, it refines it. When reason sees its limits, it becomes more honest. It stops presenting itself as the final judge of truth and becomes a tool among tools, useful, disciplined, but finite. Al Ghazali did not reject reason, he rejected its claim to absolute authority.